You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. All right, we are back, and I'm excited to talk about this episode, really more about hyaluronic acid or hyaluron, which is this other commonly used term to refer to the same thing, and go over this really precious part of the body and the fascia if you're a fascial nerd, and really look in depth at why it's important, how it works, how it shows up in a yoga practice as well as in our lives. So excited to be here again with Katja, and I'll let you start with a little preface. So take us away.
Yeah, I'm really excited to kind of open the red carpet for yet another molecule in this podcast again. So hyaluronan, it is this time. And many of us know this molecule from going to the store and picking out a new nice face cream. And then sometimes you find it in face creams, or you may have heard about it because someone might have told you they got an injection into their knee to treat some sort of problem there. So it really is widely applied or relevant to many different fields. And we also talk about it a lot in the fascia world, and now also in the yoga land. So I think it's really cool that we chat about this in a bit more depth.
Yes. And I feel like it's such a tongue twister too. I feel like whenever I teach this in trainings, I always just have everyone repeat it 10 times. And if you say it too quickly, it's a tongue twister. Hyaluronan, or hyaluronic acid. But if you're not familiar with it, maybe you've seen it a lot. Sometimes it's a lot trickier to say out loud. So I think saying it a few times to get it in your brain is helpful.
Never tried that one, but I will for sure after we finish recording. I'll try. Yeah. Maybe also, I don't know if that's also a tongue twister if you say it a lot, but jello might be. I don't know. It's not that hard, but that's also an attribute or something that we can imagine hyaluronan to be in our fascial tissues, because it's really a friend of water. That's one of the main attributes of hyaluronan. So it really holds his hand out and reaches out for the water, can bind to water. So we will chat a lot about how that is of importance in terms of sliding and gliding, and what that has to do with terms like hydration, maybe. So that's one really important aspect of hyaluronan that we're excited about in the movement realm, but also generally it creates that jello-like substance, and we'll talk about that in a second.
I love that because I think it sets the groundwork too, to really think about it as this hydrophilic molecule that's really pulling water in toward it. We talk about that a lot in the lymphatics too. And maybe at some point we'll learn more about how hyaluronan affects lymphatics and implications there. I'm sure there's more to be done there. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting one just to wrap your head around, that like pulling force of hyaluronan. See, it is a tongue twister. Pulling water towards it, which has a lot of implications for what we're going to talk about to come.
Yeah, definitely. And what I also like is that it's now being talked about a lot, and we still don't know about it in depth in terms of fascia. However, it's been discovered like a while ago, in the mid-30s or so, 1930s, so 80 years ago. It was discovered in the medical context, but in the world of fascia, it's kind of on vogue. It's a hot topic, and there's quite a lot of research being done as of now. So it's really timely to discuss this one also.
Yes, and then we have another tongue twister, which is, what it's a type of glycosaminoglycan, which is, I think, also a little bit of a tongue twister. Glycosaminoglycan, which is, that again, looking at that hydrophilic quality of being able to pull things toward it is really important to consider. So
Exactly. So it's
keep
a
that in your
sugar
head.
glycosaminoglycans. We have to practice that tongue twister as well. So it's basically a sugar molecule. It belongs to polysaccharides, to the groups of polysaccharides, and in that group, glycosaminoglycans is one type of so-called polysaccharides. So it's a long, long, long chain of sugar molecules that love to bind with water, but they can also kind of bind to themselves, so self-associate and build long, long, long chains of hyaluronic acid or hyaluronan. And we will see in a little bit, or talk about in a little bit, why that's really interesting and important, that it can be a very, very long chain, a lot longer than other polysaccharides. And that's going to be important for a lot of functions that hyaluronan displays.
I'm so excited to get to that part too. That's the interesting part, I think. We'll be there soon.
We'll be there soon. We'll cover a little bit of ground before that and just talk a teeny tiny bit generally, like where it's found and how it's produced and why it's of interest at all. Should we start with that?
Yeah. And, I think thinking about this too, for those of you in fascial world, like this really is the gel within that fascial matrix that you really laid the groundwork for already, that kind of jello analogy. But this is kind of the gel between the cells and the collagen fibers that create that, what, we call the extracellular matrix here, is a really important part of it. So think about everything in between is what we're talking about really here. Partly. I mean, it's not all hyaluronan, but it's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, to be a bit even more specific, if you have talked about fascia, or if you're familiar with its makeup, how it's structured, or what it consists of, we have all those fibers. We have collagen and elastin that are really important. Those are the protein fibers that give structure to the connective tissues. And then we have the extracellular matrix, which sounds kind of cool. And the huge part of that is the ground substance. So that's that watery jello-like substance that creates or makes up the extracellular matrix. And that is only as it is because of hyaluronan, because the water would not be bound in the extracellular matrix if we didn't have that molecule. And that's really important. And we know that this is of essence, that the water gets bound in that tissue. And that's just a very important fact if we look at what fascia is and how it works and all the wonderful attributes that we typically discuss related to fascia. This molecule is really a cool one and really interesting because it holds all that water in there.
And important. And for those of you who've done trainings with me before, who have done our MFR classes, you'll often hear me talk about there's the three main components of fascia and connective tissue. And it's what she just said too. It's the cells, it's the fibers, meaning mainly collagen fibers, and then it's the ground substance. And so what we're really talking about is hyaluronan is really an important part of this ground substance, really being that gel and fluid matrix in between the cells and the fibers that give it the structure. So yeah, a really important part in a lot of different ways and a lot of different parts of the body. So
yeah, and as you're mentioning cells within fascia, it's also interesting to see what kind of cells produce hyaluronan. So in the body, there's plenty of different cells that can produce hyaluronan, but we're focusing a little bit on fascia today. And in the fascia, it's kind of a newly discovered cool little cell, the so-called fasciacyte, that has been discovered by a group in Italy, Carla Stecco and Caterina Fede and others if you've listened along in this podcast on fascia, you probably heard about some of those great scientists before, and they have discovered the so-called fasciacytes a couple years back. So they are not exactly fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are the ones that produce the collagen in the fascial tissues, but they make hyaluronan, and they're a little bit different than fibroblasts because fibroblasts typically are a little bit longer in shape, and those fasciacytes are little and round. And what is particularly of interest is their location. So you can find them in places where there is or where multiple tissue layers are in contact. So where you have neighboring tissue layers, you can find those fasciacytes and you can find hyaluronan. And that makes sense because if we say, oh, this molecule binds water, and we think that water has to do with that sliding and gliding, it makes sense that we find plenty of that hyaluronan where we find two different surfaces or two different tissue layers that want to move easily relatively to each other, so that want to slide and glide against each other.
And this is important too. I mean, we talk about this in the myofascial release. If you've done classes or trainings with me about these gliding layers, and if you think about really any part of your body, there's multiple muscles going in different directions that have to perform slightly different movements and functions. And so, and then there's also blood vessels and nerves and other tissues running through there. And so everything has to be able to glide past each other. And it's so important for this healthy functioning of the body and communication within the body. And so this hyaluronan is such an important feature here. And it's so interesting that those fasciacytes just live right in those gliding planes there to secrete that hyaluronic acid or hyaluron. I say them together. That's the hard one. That keeps getting me. The hyaluronan or the hyaluronic acid, whichever one you prefer calling it, to be able to lubricate and create that smooth gliding motion, which you can imagine is a lot easier if you have a slip and slide surface than if you were to take two pieces of Velcro or sandpaper even, or even just fine sandpaper isn't going to glide as much as having that lubricated surface. So a really important feature, really interesting one, a new piece of information too, somewhat new in fasciacytes.
Yeah, and I don't want that sandpaper in my tissues. I also don't want sandpaper in my knee joint. And just a side note, because we're focusing on fascia, as I said, but you can imagine that also in our joint spaces, in the synovial fluid that acts as lubricant in the joints, also is very rich in hyaluronan, and also the cells that produce the synovial fluid, they also can produce hyaluronan. So that makes sense also, and that's easily imaginable that they have some of the same challenges and functions, and we can find those those molecules there as well.
And we're not even talking about the fact that water pressurizes the system, which is probably maybe a whole nother discussion, but we've got that fluid component that creates some pressurization, which is so important for the support and this kind of passive support of the tissues too.
Definitely. And going back to the joint, maybe once more, that also helps to be a shock absorber even in the joint. So that's also an important function. And going back to fascia, we also know that we can find hyaluronan in those places where we need a lot of slide and glide, but also it's now known that in different anatomic sites and different anatomical regions in the body, we can find different concentrations of hyaluronan. So there are parts where we need a little less slide and glide. And again, not so surprisingly, there are parts where we have very mobile joints, for instance, and you can imagine that we need a lot of that slide and glide there. Take your ankles and your wrists, for instance. And there we have some fascial tissues, the retinacula. So in the wrist, you can imagine that to be like a nice little 80s sweatband, or in the ankle, maybe like a fascial tennis sock, sort of. And in those tissues, we find particularly high amounts of hyaluronan. And when you know about its function, it just totally makes sense why that's there. And before we move on a little bit, I want to add one thing though, because it's not just the slide and glide. We also know that hyaluronan has many other functions. For instance, it helps cells in the extracellular matrix to move around, for instance, or also when it comes to cell growth and division, hyaluronan has some functions there. So just even if we're not focusing on that, wanted to say that this molecule has even a bit more in its bag than just the sliding and the gliding.
Well, and I think it's a great reminder too. Like we talk a lot about just the importance of water and fluids in the body. We know that there is this association of fluids with health and vitality and youthfulness, right? We know that a lot of the different layers of the body, the fluid content will decline over time with age. If we're lucky enough to live long enough, that there are fluid changes in the system. And so I just like to put that in there, that there is this just importance of this reminder of how important fluid is. And of course, you obviously need to drink water, but that's not a guarantee that your body's utilizing it well. Or as we'll talk about a little bit more too with the hyaluronic acid, is, it really is how your body's incorporating it. But of course, you also need to drink it so that it gets in your blood and then you're able to disperse that out to your interstitium and the tissues. So really important quality is just this preciousness of hydration too. So
It is. And then also now we talked about we are drinking, we're getting the hydration into the tissue. We find that hyaluronic acid there. And then one important aspect, and we'll talk about that later when it comes to movement, is also the fact that hyaluronic acid needs to be recycled at some point, right? So at some point we need to go through a cycle of getting rid of it and producing new hyaluronan. And how that's done is then through the lymphatic system. So hyaluronic acid is being transported into the bloodstream through the lymphatic system, and then the liver is going to degrade it. And that's going to be important later when we chat about movement a bit. So that's why I wanted to throw that in here also. And
gotta
as
love those lymphatics, gotta love
exactly
them.
as you've just mentioned them, I thought we need to put that in there because definitely some relationship through lymphatics known already, but who knows what else is out there and what we will know in a couple of years from now when it comes to lymphatics and hyaluronan particularly.
Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then I think maybe it's time now. You can let me know if you have something else you want to add, but I'm really excited to talk about how the shapes and lengths and densities of these hyaluronic acids are affecting its function and its use in the body. Because to me, this was a really interesting part that I learned a few years back from Antonio Stecco, is like, wow, it's not all just rainbows and butterflies. There is actually some differentiation of how it can be useful or potentially not useful in the body.
Yes, and yes. So that's where it becomes a bit more nuanced, because right now, or up to now, we have praised hyaluronan as this really cool molecule and we love it and we want it. But as always in life, it's a bit more intricate and a bit more complex when you look at it more more in depth. And so with hyaluronan, we have different so-called molecular weights. What is a molecular weight? That's basically just the sum of all the atomic masses of one molecule. So a molecule can be heavy or it can be lighter, so to say. And heavy in that context means typically that it has like a longer chain of molecules. So a long organized chain of hyaluronan molecules makes up hyaluronan with high molecular weight. And hyaluronan with high molecular weight, so long organized chain of hyaluronan, is actually beneficial. So that's what we want. That's found in intact and healthy tissue that is being associated generally, again, that's also a bit more complex, but generally that's associated with anti-inflammatory properties, also regarded as beneficial when it comes to our immune response. So long, heavy hyaluronan chains, thumbs up. We like them. But also, there is shorter fragments, so shorter chains of hyaluronan that have a lower molecular weight, and them we don't like so much generally. There are nuances to this again, but generally the lower weights, the shorter chains, we don't like so much. Why? They are being described as rather pro-inflammatory. They're also sometimes found in certain pathological states. For instance, they have been related to poor cancer prognosis, to cartilage destruction, to certain rheumatic diseases. So couple of aspects why that might not be so beneficial. And you're probably asking yourself already, why are those shorter chains not as beneficial? They tend to kind of self-stick. So I imagine that to be, I have no idea if that's correct, I'm not a biochemist, but I imagine the shorter fragments to kind of lump up a bit more. So it's not that one long organized chain with a nice structure, but more of a lump. And that aggregation or self-sticky lump of hyaluronan then will make up all those not so positive aspects or properties of hyaluronan. It's kind of simplified, but that's the main gist about that one.
So we come full circle back to what I was really excited about too, is the self-aggregation, not only how different types of molecules, higher versus lower molecular weight molecules, can have different effects, but also this self-aggregation or self-binding of hyaluronan, and how it changes its function too, which I think is really interesting, because now it's not binding to water, so it's not having that same function that we were talking about, that hydrophilic function of pulling and attracting water to it. And so there's a lot of therapeutic implications there too, I think, which are really interesting.
Yeah, so that self-aggregation, we can also term this densification. You may have heard of that already. So densification is when the hyaluronan kind of aggregates into, I'm going to say lump again, even though I don't know if that's chemically correct, but just
I like
to put an image out there. And I think that's maybe an image that works, so you can kind of transfer that to the fact that those self-aggregated densified hyaluronan molecules, they don't enable that sliding and gliding so much. And when you have such self-aggregated, shorter, fragmented hyaluronan in the tissue, you can also imagine that the forces that go through the fascial tissues, they might fall differently through the tissues or might act differently on the tissues. So imagine any type of movement, of exercise, and imagine how that lands mechanically in your tissues if you have a lot of that densification, a lot of that self-aggregation.
And I think the easiest way too to think about this too, because when we have that densification or self-aggregation, we also have a change in the viscosity of the tissues. And so viscosity, think of, with an increased viscosity, it becomes more like jello and less like fluid. It becomes more thick and viscous and less fluid. So, when we increase the viscosity here, we see a lot of issues with mobility and inflammation. That lubrication property starts to decrease, that gliding and sliding decreases. Potentially we get more cross-links. So you can imagine how that densification might look too, or feel, if you were on a microscopic level, or in your body even potentially if it was significant. But that densification is also associated with that change in viscosity, which is really what creates a lot of the functional issues too, in being able to glide easily, that we've been talking about, which is so important.
Yes. The good news is, though, because that doesn't sound like a good message, good news we put out there. The good news is that we think, or we hypothesize, that those densifications, those aggregations of the shorter hyaluronic acid molecules can be reversed in a certain time frame. And we think that a couple of things help do that. For instance, the application of mechanical force. That sounds harsh, but we'll discuss how that translates to yoga. Also, temperature is a big one. More about that in a minute. And also just generally your biochemical milieu. So your pH, how acidic or how alkaline the tissue is locally, that can also have an impact on those densifications. And that is now the time when we can talk a bit about how yoga, movement, exercise, lifestyle can affect that. So that's the good news. We do think that we can do something about it.
Yeah, and that there are multiple levers which can go in a positive or negative direction, right? Those levers can influence the tissues in a negative way, but we can also influence those levers to change the tissue, which we're going to talk about next. So I think, phew, there's plenty of intervention points, or at least there's some.
Yeah. Some that we hope, some that we think, and again, research being done on this as we speak, and hopefully also even more in the future. Why don't we start by explaining what happens when we don't move? So bringing this into the context of movement and non-movement or immobility. So when we move, generally, hyaluronan is being produced. Yay! Long, high weight molecules, hopefully. And then what is important also is it is being recycled. So when we move, hyaluronan is being made and it's being recycled in the correct way, so to say.
And I love that because I picture those little fascia sites, right, in the gliding zones, literally listening. They sense that movement between the layers, and in response, they upregulate and secrete more hyaluronic acid. So it's a pretty brilliant. I like thinking about them listening, though, like my body is taking care of me.
It is. And then if you're immobile and you're just hanging out on your couch, they're listening as well. And they will also say, Tiffany, you should be moving more. We don't have any slide and glide in here. Okay, I'm going to give you more hyaluronan because we need the slide and glide. So even if you're sitting on your couch, they will produce more hyaluronan. We will have a surge in hyaluronan, but there won't be that normal, healthy recycling path of hyaluronan. So you have kind of that surge, you have an increase in hyaluronan production, but the hyaluronan just hangs out there, and it's probably going to be might be that shorter fragment type hyaluronan. So you don't have the effect of recycling. And again, then that leads to that aggregation of hyaluronan. And we've talked about that just a minute ago. So you can imagine how that goes. Viscosity changes. So the viscosity goes up when you're immobile, the tissue doesn't flow, or the tissue doesn't flow, the hyaluronan solution doesn't flow as well. It's more viscous, and then that has an influence on your mobility, on your range of motion, through that viscosity and through that slide and glide. So no bueno.
And you can think about this too, like again, this viscosity is also this ability to become thinner with movement and more fluid, and then as we become more sedentary, becoming thicker. So we've got this viscoelasticity in the fascia that's responding to that too. So not only are the fasciocytes listening, but the actual viscosity of the tissues is changing when we move or don't move as well.
Yeah. So, and that's where the movement definitely comes in also. So it's not just the fact that hyaluronan is produced and recycled, but through movement, we apply mechanical forces to the tissue. And that sounds kind of technical, but it's what you do. When you move, you have forces on your tissue. You have mechanical forces on your tissue. And that then in turn will help you to decrease viscosity. So things become more fluid, literally. And particularly, we know that about shear forces. So when you come at the tissue at an angle, or when the layers move in relation to each other, that's ideas how we think, or how we could translate that into the movement practice, into yoga, to be creative with those mechanical forces, so to say.
Yeah. And my favorite part that we were talking about before we started too, which I think is pretty interesting, is that that can also have implications for changes in molecular weight and the densification and self-aggregation, which I think gives us some really positive inputs to use as well.
Yeah, so the hyaluronan production definitely, or it has a direct relationship with that, or is responsive to those mechanical forces. And that's one explanation, one mechanism how we can directly impact that situation, the function of hyaluronan, with mechanical forces. That's the assumption that we have right now. But it's not only mechanical forces. So it's also other things like temperature. And yeah, when you have high temperatures in the tissues, hyaluronan, the three-dimensional structure of hyaluronan, will break down, basically. And again, the tissue will become, or the viscosity will go down, so that hyaluronan solution becomes more fluid, or flows more easily. So the higher the temperature, the more of that breakdown we have. And an amount, if you wonder how high should what temperature are you talking about, it's about 40 degrees Celsius, I think. I looked it up. I'm not sure. It should be 104 Fahrenheit, but so
Well,
my mind works in degrees Celsius. That's 40 degrees. Hopefully that's 104 Fahrenheit if I looked it up correctly.
and I think this is a great point to talk about what can be oftentimes a controversial subject, which is this idea of being able to create hydration within the fascia. Because what we just talked about was really that we can influence this thickening or densification or self aggregation that happens, as well as potentially the molecular weight of hyaluronic acid through movement, through gliding, probably also through self massage or manual therapy as well. As these things really influence how the hyaluronic acid is binding to water, as well as the viscosity. And so, I really like personally using the term hydration when we're talking about doing myofascial release and other kind of self massage techniques, because it creates just a really easy visual for people. As a teacher, I don't want to or need to or sometimes have the time in a short yoga class to talk about exactly what's happening in the fascia, the connective tissue, much less hyaluronic acid and how it's binding to water. And so, being able to summarize these things in a succinct way, for me, that's not always completely scientifically accurate. Hydration is a pretty broad general word. It's not scientifically specific so much. But to be able to communicate and convey an idea really succinctly is such a precious thing in yoga. And we can see already, just from what we've talked about, there's a lot of implications both for movement to change that viscosity, which is a sense of hydration, right? If I go from this kind of really thick sludge in the body to this thin fluid that allows for better transportation, we talked about, as well as better gliding, so better communication and better movement, as well as self-massage can influence this molecular weight, this densification and self-aggregation, how the hyaluronic acid is binding to water. What we're talking about it loosely is hydration. So, if you want to be more accurate and scientifically specific, you could go into the details of this in a class. But I just think for most people, they want to practice and experience. For me, that's the real selling point with myofascial release, is feeling it too.
I very much agree. I think if we started to, in a detailed way, discuss viscosity and molecules in the yoga class, unless it's a very specific training on that topic, would create boundaries, not only of Yeah, of different types. So yeah, I agree. Sometimes we just need to work with those visuals, knowing that in fact they are a bit more nuanced. But you know, you as a practitioner out there or as a teacher out there, you also don't need to be a biochemist to get a general idea about this. But that's our goal with those podcasts and with the many excellent yoga medicine trainings, to give you enough understanding what is happening so that you find language that is not incorrect, but also you don't need to be a scientist
Yeah. Yeah.
dressed as a yoga teacher.
Yeah.
That's not helpful. But having a general understanding, a general idea about this and the mechanisms that might influence this, I think is helpful, because it also
Yeah.
helps you not only to find good language, but also it helps you to structure your class or find what movement works for you if that is an issue. So say you're intrigued by the temperature bit we just discussed. So that makes sense, yes. So you can think about going to a heated yoga class in a different way now. Or you might think about, oh, what does it do if we have like a very vigorous part of the practice in the beginning? What is that going to do to hyaluronan? And you might use that even more intentionally in your practice, in your teaching than you did before, because you have another puzzle piece, why and how that might be beneficial for your fascial tissues, for your hyaluronan in that context. Yeah, so you're just equipped and understand a little bit better what has been maybe part
Yeah.
of your practice or your movement bit already.
Well, I think one big part too for me is that in a yoga practice, I really love learning. And as a teacher, I like planting seeds. However, it's balanced with this reminder that yoga is really a big part of it is about being present in our bodies and listening and tuning in. And so there is this balance of when do I plant information in a class, at what point in the class, how much am I talking? Am I leaving silence? And so I think what you said is true, really important too, as a teacher, though, by understanding these, then I can answer questions, if you're a healthcare provider to your patient or as a yoga teacher to your student, and they're like, well, what does that mean? Well, it's just changing how your body is binding and utilizing water is sometimes a really easy way to say it. But now you understand a little bit more that it's potentially changing the molecular weight of hyaluronic acid, which is really important to its function and implications therapeutically. Also potentially changing how it's uh, self-aggregating, creating that densification and thickening, and potentially at some point then also fibrosis, which is a lot harder to change. But it also helps me as a yoga teacher to plan. And, we go into this in a lot more detail in my functional anatomy course too, if you really like to geek out on the microscopic details of fascia and all the other different aspects of it. But I think just having a big picture is helpful too, whether you're a student or a teacher, just kind of getting a visual of how these things interact and the implications they might have is the perfect tool to have in our pocket.
Yes. And what I want to add to that, it's not specifically related to the bits of information that we shared here just now, but generally, I think it also really matters what kind of setting and what kind of population you're teaching to.
Yes.
So, say you are teaching yoga to a very adept and keen population, athletes that want to know what's going on in their body, you may share a couple more bits and pieces of knowledge and of facts.
Yeah.
And then when someone understands, oh, okay, that's cool, that happens in my body, sometimes then that opens the avenue for the feeling and for the letting go and for then focus on sensation, and people can relax more into their practice. So sometimes it's almost like a gateway to provide a little bit of info. It's a gateway for people to accept what's happening, and then they can focus on the sensation and just on the feeling and on the movement. But that's just a side note, because I think that's related to pretty much any information you provide in a yoga class.
Yeah.
Just wanted to put
I agree.
that out there. Yeah.
So, go ahead. Yeah.
Just one last thing that because we've been talking about, okay, how can densification, how can those aggregations of hyaluronan potentially be reversed? And we discussed movement, in terms of mechanical forces, we discussed temperature, maybe in a hot class, maybe in a vigorous practice. And there's also pH levels. So how alkaline or how acidic your tissue locally is. That also has an influence on hyaluronan. For instance, we know that within a muscle compartment, after really intense exercise, lactic acid can accumulate and the tissue locally can become really acidic. And that goes along with an increase in viscosity. So again, with not as much flow or a slower flow of the hyaluronic solution than an alkaline situation or environment. So we also know that that has an influence, and that's something that you might have experienced after a really intense bout of exercise, that momentary sensation of stiffness or of immobility. And that can actually also, among other things, be related to the changes or influence that has on hyaluronan also. And that's also something I find really cool.
And so I think it's also just another advertisement for yoga for athletes too, of how important it is, to do your cool down, to do your recovery practices, and that the yoga can be very simple, but to maybe even after this episode too, just having in mind this visual of this thixotropic nature. We haven't mentioned that yet, but these tissues are thixotropic, meaning they become more fluid with movement and more viscous or thick sludge-like with less movement. And so we can use just simple, gentle, repetitive movements of sorts to help alter that viscosity post-workout. Obviously there's been a lot of intensive movement, so we don't necessarily need that, but just creating that gliding between the layers, especially maybe in areas that are more prone to stiffness for you. And so maybe potentially influencing that viscosity through some gliding or through some myofascial release, if you prefer. We talk a lot about this on the Yoga for Athletes training and how we can influence recovery, but it's such a big impact. And this is part of that recovery picture too. So an important part of it.
Exactly. And then that can also play into the decision which kind of tools you want to use for that MFR. If you want to impact more the deeper tissues, because we find hyaluronan between the deeper fascial tissues and the muscle layers, then you might go maybe with a more targeted tool, with a smaller tool like myofascial release balls, because through that smaller surface, you can just apply more pressure and can reach the deeper levels. Or if you want to stay really broad and superficial and you want to target the hyaluronan and the gliding in the more superficial layers, you pick maybe tools that are a bit broader and softer, maybe some sort of softer foam roller, for instance, or just even a rolled up blanket or something like that. So that also plays into that and kind of goes full circle as we discussed where we can find hyaluronan in the tissue. That then can also impact how you think about where you want to go with this and why you want to go there.
I think that's perfect too, because for those of you who do myofascial release with us, you've probably heard the term shearing too. So we can use some of those shearing techniques, which is basically moving the tissue layers past each other with the myofascial release. We're kind of pinning down that superficial layer and moving the deep layer underneath it to try and stimulate those fasciocytes. So a nice kind of a little bit more specific. There's a lot of protocols and tools we can use of MFR and yoga. You could imagine too, just moving through some simple yoga movements too, potentially also creating that gliding to help not only with the viscosity, but trigger those fasciocytes. So a lot of different implications. And what's cool about this too is that it doesn't really require a lot of effort. It does require a little bit of knowledge, but hopefully just from this one podcast, it's been at least a little dose of information that can start using. Oh,
And
you know
and
what?
and if you want to dive like really into depth, there's one great article I can recommend, and that's open access. So you don't have to be affiliated with a university or so. And we're gonna link to that in
Yay.
the show notes, of course. That's by Rebecca Pratt. And it's called Hyaluronan in the Fascial Frontier. And what we've been discussing here today is drawing from that article heavily, very heavily. So if you want to dig deeper or look something up in more depth, that's definitely a resource I can recommend, and we will link to that as well.
I think the only thing we didn't touch on yet was the fibrosis, which is kind of the effect of that densification. Did you want to mention a little bit about that too?
Yeah, we could discuss that a little bit.
Just
So
brief.
that's an hypothesis that's out there. Antonio Stecco, who is the brother of Carla Stecco, who you might have heard before, also from Italy, from that Italian group. He has put forth an hypothesis, and we can also link to that article in the show notes, that process of self-aggregation, of densification, is kind of a process over time. So that takes a while, right? Until you have more of that densification in the tissue, and then that densification, that self-aggregation, that gets more and gets more and gets more. And in the beginning, it's easier to reverse that self-aggregation. It's easier to reverse the densification like we just discussed. But over time, it's going to get harder. And at some point, the scale might even tip, and you might come into a situation where you have fibrosis. So that's then a situation of aggregation in the tissue, of cross bindings or cross links in the tissues, and more of the fibrous tissue contents in a not so organized architecture. And that is then so much harder to be reversed, or maybe not even possible to be reversed. So what he is putting out there is that we find ourselves in a process. It's not, okay, I'm not moving today, all is well, and then tomorrow I have fibrosis. And I think if we look at the wording in the realms of manual techniques, manual therapy, and also in the realms of movement, we sometimes focus more, or have in the past focused more, on that fibrosis bit. Everyone talks about tissue adhesions and the fibrosis that we're breaking up. But in fact, I think that this densification part of it, and that longer process of building up a certain state of densification, is a very good information for us, because that provides a window, a therapeutic window, if you like, to actually work on the densification by means like we discussed, but also manual therapy and other things. And then gradually you're building towards that fibrosis, and then that's going to be harder to be influenced. And that's good news, because it provides a window. And also, I think it clarifies maybe a bit the language use that we've seen in fields like yoga and neighboring fields, that might not be as accurate anymore, as we understand more now. And as mentioned, this is not like, we don't have millions of articles on this related to the fascia yet, but it's being researched by Antonio Stecco and others as of now.
And one question I get a lot when we have these conversations in our trainings is, sometimes people get a little upset maybe that their doctor hasn't tested for these things. And so I always just like to note too, a lot of this is still just being done in the research. There are no clinically relevant diagnostic tools to be able to look at this. And so it is a challenging thing as a clinician, if you're working with patients, as a healthcare provider, or as a patient yourself, just knowing that it's not an easy thing always to diagnose, but to know that, this is our physical body. It's something that's constantly changing. And to be able to have these self-care tools can be really helpful, potentially to prevent. And I hate thinking of it as prevention, because sometimes that has a fear-based sense to it, like, I have to do this thing, but more of an empowerment tool to be able to utilize to help support the health of this system and the vitality and fluidity, and not only the movement but also communication aspects to that. So, just keep in mind it's not something that we're able to diagnose in a clinical setting yet. Maybe in 10 years from now things will be different, who knows, but so much good information. Hopefully you're sensing the preciousness of this molecule. Hyaluronic acid is such a key one that you've probably heard of before, but just again, really sensing that this molecule is precious partly because it's attracting water and utilizing it to both help support communication and movement and probably a lot of other things in the body. We might find out a lot more too, but that it's not as straightforward as just drinking water or just having hyaluronic acid in itself, but that it is really about the specificity of it, the molecular weight of this molecule, the concentration, how it's binding, so that aggregation as well. So there's a lot of intervention points that we've talked about, both in movement. We've mentioned MFR or massage. That could be body work that's done to you. That could be self massage, temperature, pH. We've talked about its implications too in MFR, myofascial kind of terminology, and how we can kind of more succinctly talk about these things just as referring to it as the hydration of the tissue, because we all have that positive implication of hydration. Or if we need to answer questions and break it down a little bit more, we can also talk about how important it is, how it's binding to water, and that, some of these modalities can be a helpful way to kind of support that molecular weight and that self-aggregation or lack of less self-aggregation in the tissues to support the health of the tissues. And such brilliant and impactful and effective self-care tools. I know if you've ever tried it, you've probably experienced this on yourself. Not only in a yoga class, like I think you can really feel the effects of this in a yoga class if you go to just like a slow flow class where you're not really doing anything very targeted or specific, but you're just moving the whole body a lot, and you feel better range of motion potentially at the end, partly potentially due to that changes in viscosity, partly due to the gliding between the tissues maybe. But being able to kind of feel that, if you've done MFR, you've probably felt that right away firsthand. That's why I love MFRs, because you can feel it instantly. You feel those effects. But a big part of that is probably due to what we've talked about today. Or maybe it's a hot yoga class. We did talk about how above 40 degrees Celsius can also influence this. And so also may be the case for hot yoga class. I think there's a lot more to that conversation too, as far as practicing hot yoga all the time and fluid balancing and electrolyte balancing. And so I think it's also important to remember it's so easy to like want to throw one thing away. At yoga medicine, I think it's so important for us to remember that everything has a place, even hot yoga and MFR and just a general well-rounded slow flow class without anything in particular, or going into a practice with this intention of influencing this fluid system, also might change how you move too. It might help you not grip and grasp as much, as you're able to just kind of target this easy gliding that happens naturally with movement. It doesn't really take a lot of muscular effort. Of course, muscles move us, so they're acting somewhat, but perhaps it changes how you interact with it, and just having a new lens through which to look at your practice and this more molecular side of things.
Yeah, and I think you've just summarized all that beautifully and put it into practical application beautifully. What I also just generally like, and that's about our beginner's mind again, which is also related to the yoga practice, right? It's about the nuances. It's about being curious about the nuances. And in this short conversation, we didn't dive into study of biochemistry. So of course, what we've put out there with the molecular weight and how that changes with different interventions and so on is just on a very abstract, generalized level. But it is a great opportunity when you look at complex molecules like this to just be aware that things are so nuanced, and it's never that black and white how we sometimes like to portray it. It's necessary to portray it that way just to grasp the general concept of it, but it's also beautiful sometimes to go into a more in-depth study of these things to find that nuance and that grayscale or that color scale that lies at the heart of those things. So just again, putting it out there, some of the things have been a bit generalized, maybe that we discussed today, and keeping that beginner's mind and that love for the nuance is also something that I strongly relate to yoga medicine, to have that curiousness and to to be interested in the nuances, and also to have that beginner's mind when it comes to looking ahead. And as you mentioned, that we're just in the beginnings of finding those diagnostic tools or applying the diagnostic tools. There's a couple that are out there, some start working with them. It's just going to be exciting to see, even in 2, 3, 4 years, how far we've come. I remember at the Fascia Research Congress in Berlin, I think it was discussed the different anatomic sites where you can find hyaluronan. And just in the last 4 years or so, so much has happened in that field of research. And just thinking a couple of years ahead, what we are discussing today will probably not hold true to the full extent anymore, because it's just rapidly evolving. And I like that also about that train of research, and that fits in my personal how should I say, in my personal appreciation for yoga medicine, because it's the spirit that we have is to incorporate all those super new things, even if they're not fully cooked yet in all of the cases, and keeping that beginner's mind to incorporate those exciting findings and experimenting with them a little bit as well.
Well said. Thank you. Yeah. And, I think it's always a good reminder too that we're looking at one part of the body. There's so much more to this. And even though we're just taking a quick little glimpse in, giving you a nice overview into this topic of hyaluronic acid and its implications, like Katja said, there's always more to learn and there's always more information to come. So, what I think is beautiful about that is allowing you to live in the experiment and see what's helpful for you. Because even with the best theory and the best research protocols, not everyone respond in the same way. And again, there's always more to the picture. So feel, listen, experiment. And, if you're wanting to learn more, if you're really curious about this more molecular side of things, the more microscopic side, we have a full course called Functional Anatomy, which really digs into the molecular side of fascia and how it really functions as an important part of our anatomical system, which is so much more than just our muscles, the small role that our muscles can play, but there's so much more to it. I also mentioned the training we have on athletes, which if you're interested more in recovery and supporting athletes is a great one. If you're looking more for myofascial release techniques and information, we've got a short and a long course on myofascial release, one full length one that's really aimed at teachers that gives over 100 different protocols for every different part of the body. So you can be really specific and understand the science behind the fascia, this included, to really understand what, how, and why you might apply things. And we have all of our orthopedic courses as well. If you're interested in working with pain in the body, we've got our shoulder, hip, spine. So there's always more to learn. And I just mentioned that in case you're looking for more information, but this gives you something that you can run with now. And, if you want or need more information, we've got resources for you, but it gives you something that you can think about. And like we both said too, is part of it might just be the lens through which you see your practice. The next time you step on your mat might be a little different as you think about this fluid layer. And one of my favorite parts is how it is responsive. It's listening and responding to demands, whether that's being mobile or sedentary or hopping or moving in certain poses. It's listening. The system is built to be resilient and listen and be intelligent. And so as we continue to learn more about ourselves and about the science, we can continue to evolve. I really appreciate all your information and insights, Katja. It was a great, awesome episode. Anything last you have to? Awesome. Yes. Perfect ending. We look forward to seeing you next time. I hope it was helpful. Let us know in the comments if you had things that you found that were helpful or have ideas for the future. Thank you.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.